I think Ashton, you've actually been studying astrology way longer than I have, since you were a teenager. And
Yeah.
I came to it pretty late, kind of on accident in graduate school, studying with Rick Tarnas, author of Cosmos and Psyche. And um, I didn't come to grad school expecting to learn astrology from Rick, but to learn the history of philosophy from Rick. But I ended up absorbing a lot of it, particularly his approach through the planetary archetypes. But I think my primary interest has really always been in the history of astrology as a way of understanding the evolution of consciousness and shifting forms of participation, because we can see in the origins of astrology, so far as we can tell, that what has become dissociated in the modern period, science, art, religion, politics, in the time of the origins of astrology, all of those were kind of compact in this study of the movements of the heavens, such that it had I mean, it's in some sense the origins of astronomy. It's an artistic and divinatory practice. I mean, so much of the prehistorical art, whether in caves or early temples and stuff, is an attempt to mirror the heavens, and constellations and so on. And so much of myth is in resonance with the movements of the heavens. And so, yeah, that's always been my initial entryway into astrology, as an example of the evolution of consciousness. But in the contemporary world, it's quite popular and has been given kind of a psychological interpretation. The Theosophical movement in the late 19th and early 20th century kind of played a role in revitalizing it. But maybe we could get this conversation rolling if you share a little bit about how you first discovered astrology and why it spoke to you when you were a teenager, right?
Yeah, well, like many people, I had already learned about astrology before I was a teenager. Just, you learn your sun sign. And I think interestingly, for a lot of people who were born in the late 80s and early 90s, we grew up with a lot of media that was saturated in it. So, for example, a lot of us played The Sims. And when you created characters on The Sims, you had to select zodiac signs for them. And synastry was built into the programming of how the characters got along with each other, so you could learn it through that.
Really? I didn't know
Yeah.
that about The Sims. That's so cool.
Yeah, and so there was that, and then there was like Lisa Frank stickers of the zodiac signs, and there were just a lot of, I just think a lot of the media of the 90s and early 2000s was very magical. And so I had learned about like my zodiac sign before, I reached my teens. Partially, I think I was first introduced to it by one of my neighbors, who was like a sibling to me. And so I was already in learning. We were all, there was like a group of us that all hung out, and we all knew each other's signs, and we were all playing The Sims together. And so we were kind of aware of the synastry descriptions. And so I feel like I discovered it, and it felt resonant already then, through this sort of living experience of being, of friendship, and appreciating what was distinct about each of my friends, and you know and our relationships to each other. um and and then, yeah, when I was in high school, I used MySpace. And MySpace had, like, part of the interface at one point had this astrology compatibility um, little thing where you could, I guess, find out the signs of your friends that you were friends with on MySpace, and then read compatibility interpretations. And that again, I like rediscovered that, and I don't think I had really discovered like compatibility interpretation like that before, like with that full description. And it again felt really, really resonant to me, and that was really what led me to, somehow I just was clicking around on the internet and discovered that there's more than sun sign astrology. and I discovered my natal chart somehow, probably through cafe astrology. That's how a lot of people first discovered astrology, at least for I think millennials. And and then I had this experience that many people have, I think, who for whom astrology resonates, that I felt like I was being observed by
Mm.
something outside of myself in the interpretations, in my kind of synthetic activity of bringing the various interpretations of the different chart placements together. And so I just began to live with it from then on. So that I was about 16 when that happened. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. So it seems like your interests emerged out of the insight it could bring to interpersonal relationships, to understanding friends, and I guess in those years, as in your late teens and high school and stuff, learning about yourself,
Yeah.
um, but feeling seen by the universe.
hmm Yeah, yeah, and I was sort of coming out, I was at a phase that many of us go through. I was sort of reactionary atheist phase and just being really rebellious. And I grew up in Arkansas, so, what Christianity represented to me then, based on what I was surrounded by, it just felt like something so silly. And so it felt like this experience with astrology. I don't ever really remember being super skeptical about things like astrology. I think I've always been interested in magic, and like when I discovered mythology, which was I was introduced to by the same neighbor, it just felt so alive and exciting to me. So I don't think that I was ever a skeptic per se, but I just didn't really know what to think about it. Or I just hadn't really like thought that hard metaphysically about its reality. But
When did that first happen? I mean, thinking about how it might be possible and what it says about the nature of the universe, did that happen just later in college and grad school, or you were earlier you had started to think about that?
well, in high school, definitely when I discovered the natal chart, and I looked at all my friends' natal charts, and I discovered
Mm.
transit astrology. And so I became very, I mean, I began to like live and breathe it every day. And it felt like the resonance with, like the kind of felt truth of what I was learning in interpreting my own chart and transits and that of others. I felt like I was being returned to something in about childhood, like that I felt had been kind of maybe drained away by growing up into, a materialist imaginary, but I just felt like it all come pouring back in.
Mm.
Like, oh wow, these things that I always, you know, wanted to be real are real. And it was also, it coincided with like experiencing psychedelics and, for the first time. And so I remember like me and my friends were, we were talking about this and, also trying to like meditate with crystals and things. We were experimenting with new age stuff. And we had the guy who like sold us acid came over and was like telling us about the Saturn return. And it was just this I just felt mystery, like, and also like something to hold on to at the same time. And yeah, so that's sort of it, yeah, I would say the kind of metaphysical speculation. Well, first it was experience, and then the more experience I had, the questions could start to arise.
Mm. And so you considered yourself an atheist as a teenager, specifically in relationship to what you perceive to be the Christian God and the it's kind of a reaction
Yeah,
against the cultural influence of Christianity. But did you think that there might still be a divine dimension to the universe in some non-Christian sense?
yeah, I think I was an atheist. I don't think I was actually an atheist. I said I was, but I think that was more of an act of rebellion than it was an actual reflection of my felt orientation to the world, because I definitely always felt as if there was meaning, in that in life, and that I wanted to bring my life. Yeah, I wanted to unfold a meaningful life and be in connection with
Hmm.
whatever is, the divine that's bound up with significance in life. So yeah, I would say that not genuine atheism, but almost like a kind of cultural atheism. I don't know how to,
Sure.
yeah.
Um, so maybe this is a part of myself, but I always, whenever I talk about astrology, um, in a podcast, feel like I have to acknowledge the people for whom
Hmm.
even just hearing us take it seriously, uh, will be triggered and just express outrage, that intellectual, educated, scientifically literate people would take it seriously. And so, like, and I admit that's like a part of myself too, because I see some ways in which astrology is engaged with that can be very much about. I mean, you said this yourself, like it was someone could criticize astrology for being like wishful thinking. Like,
Hmm.
wouldn't it be nice if the whole cosmos just mirrored our inner states and like made us feel like we were seen in this deep way?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be nice? But you can also flip that and say, wouldn't it be terrifying and intrusive to be so transparent, like that you're actually unable to hide who you are because it's like you're so in sync with the larger patterns of the world around you, um, that it might even feel like an intrusion into your privacy or something. Um, you
Ah,
know.
yeah.
And because some people get really uncomfortable, some astrologers I've seen get uncomfortable with like their own chart just being out there, and like they kind of want
Hmm.
to hold that because of how sacred it is in a sense that it's a little picture of your soul, and it's like being naked in front of the cosmos or in front of someone who knows how to read it. Um, Even though it's more like I think Becca Tarnas uses this metaphor. Maybe I don't know if she picked it up from someone else, but it's helpful to think of the chart as the score, the musical score, which can be performed in a variety of ways. So two different astrologers might read the same chart and like bring out different nuances and aspects of it. So it's not just um, you can't understand what it means in a literal, flattened, right or wrong way. There's some nuance and room to massage. But anyways, I wonder, how do you respond to the skeptics? Like, do you have that inner skeptic yourself, that voice in yourself that wonders about this, or do you feel like you have no doubt? But when you do meet people who do doubt, how do you tend to engage with them?
Well, I've definitely gone through phases of how I need relate to skeptics, and that has been a big impetus for my own need to learn more about the history and philosophy of astrology, especially like in my early 20s or during my undergrad. I was like surrounded by a lot of intellectuals and punks and people. We were just so kind of always debating about everything anyway. And so now, I mean, I think what I always would say pretty early on is just that I think it's something that one has to be, it's a participatory, the confidence that one can gain in the reality of something that astrological systems reflect is one that you can only really gain through receptive experience or experience that is born out of a receptive consideration of, I think, especially transits can be something that you can learn from and gain a kind of confidence in the the reality of something behind all this. And I say that, I make that kind of qualified statement because I think there is a lot to be skeptical about and critical about when it comes to the various systems. But yeah, I would say, I would also question, it would be a kind of case by case discussion because I would also wonder about presuppositions that the individual skeptic has that are informing their skepticism? Like what assumptions do they have about what counts as knowledge and the relationship between human subjectivity to the world without? I think these are philosophical questions
Mhm.
that often people who are skeptical, may or may not have thought that much about and may just be operating from a kind of default absorption of the prevailing worldview.
Yeah. 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 Participation seems key. And if we think about the evolution of consciousness and, the way Steiner or Barfield will talk about our period as the age of the consciousness soul, where we're most alienated from the cosmos and most prone to a materialistic outlook. Barfield calls it the null point, right? And in that sort of a situation, we're very hungry for reconnection to a source of meaning outside of ourselves. And yet, I think this, as much as I do feel that participatory connection to a meaning that like rays in from the cosmos and isn't just being projected by me, I can't help but also wonder sometimes, like, when I experience the correlation during a transit, I'm like, wow, that like really, I feel held by the symbolism of this. And then in another mood, I might feel like I'm just like
Uh-huh.
projecting. And I think that's healthy to keep that sort of
Mhm.
capacity to second guess ourselves. But one of the dangers that I worry about in this age of the consciousness soul, when we're so hungry for meaning, is that we can give over too much of our freedom to this external source of meaning, and then it becomes like our sole source of guidance and like a map that can never lead us wrong, never lead us astray. And so I think the healthy relationship that I have found is that yes, it can serve astrology, tracking transits can serve as a guide, but at this point in the evolution of consciousness, our freedom as thinkers and as individuals is not to be given away uh, to some external locus of meaning. So I think astrology is being reborn in our time, and I mean the whole 20th century was this process of rediscovery of astrology in a way, in a popular sense. Um, I mean, we could explore that actually, but it's different from ancient astrology. It's different from the way that it was practiced prior to the rise of modern science and the rise of the consciousness soul, or this sense of individual freedom, right? So maybe talk about that, how to protect freedom from the way that astrology may have been interpreted in the past as fated, but maybe it wasn't interpreted that way. You've been studying ancient Hellenistic astrology, so maybe you can share a little bit about how astrology was understood in that time and what might be different in our time.
Mhm. Yes. So I have, for the last year, about the last year, been learning about Hellenistic astrology with Adam Ellenboss. He's got like the Nightlight School of Astrology. And one thing that he emphasizes that I really appreciate is that, and I feel like I personally need to learn more about ancient views, and he's drawing from Indian tradition as well as the Hellenistic tradition, but he says that for ancient people, there wasn't this identification of the individual with the chart, but rather this more or less widespread understanding of the spirit as eternal and much more. And maybe this is more the way he's emphasizing things personally, but that the human spirit transcends the chart, and the chart is just an image of the lot that individual is working with in that incarnation. And it can also be read, as you suggested, like a score. It can be read in many ways at different times throughout the life, depending on the questions that are brought to the chart. So I think keeping that in mind is important for, yeah, not giving away our freedom and defining ourselves according to the limits of our birth chart.
Hmm.
And also and this is something that Geoffrey Cornelius, who was an astrologer and philosopher, he died not too long ago, but wrote this significant book called The Moment of Astrology, where he's criticizing the certain approach to astrology that ends up somewhat trivializing the importance of the birth time. And he's emphasizing that the origins of astrology, well, arose out of what he calls Catarche or Catarchic astrology, which was all about basically divination. So like there would always be some kind of question that was being brought to the oracle. And so there was always context. It wasn't this situation where, we were giving a general description of a personality based on the chart, but that a chart was speaking to a very sort of vital concern in the form of a question, like, is this the proper time for us to enact the ritual gods? That
Mm.
kind of thing. And so when we recollect the origins of astrology out of that, it doesn't have to negate what has arisen in the meantime, as far as like psychological astrology, but it also, I think it helps us to remember that the practice of divination is always bound up with participation in this meaningful cosmic order, that the chart is just a brief picture, a momentary snapshot of. It doesn't exhaust it. And so I think that's ultimately something that anybody interested in astrology today should keep in mind, is that when we're working with this for ourselves or for other people, that ideally that moment of feeling like you're being seen from the cosmos leads to a transformation in your everyday experience of the world. And so if it leads instead to a kind of obsessive preoccupation with interpreting everything according to, your personal wishes or your sort of personal mythologizing, that would be in the opposite direction to in a way, like it'd be a kind
Mm.
of like false egoic enchantment.
Right. Yeah. So is it wrong to say that ancient astrology, and I assume there were different schools of thought and there was some disagreement. I mean, there couldn't
Yeah.
possibly have been one universal, like agreed upon way. Obviously, this tradition was different from what was going on in the medieval European world, and China probably has its own way of doing this. But my assumption has been that the idea of, casting a chart for an individual, because first of all, you need a lot of expertise to even draw up a chart. And people didn't even know necessarily the exact time that they were born, And so it was
Yeah.
usually kings that had charts done for them, like very special, significant individuals, whereas most people, maybe they wanted to know about the transits because they're about to make a decision. And if they could afford a reading from someone, they would go do that. But is that right? Like there wasn't as much of a focus on the individual, in the ancient world.
Well, yeah, I think at least the origins of astrology, because there's other divination forms of divination. Yes, I think from what I've learned, the origins of, what we call astrology today were more focused on the king, or just charts being cast for the welfare of the nation or the empire. So it had this more macro concern, and gradually,
Right.
you know,
Right. And it kind of tracks with the evolution of consciousness.
yes.
Like this focus on individual souls, I think it really gets kicked off in Europe uh, and in ancient Israel with Christ and the focus on um, interiority and the personal salvation. And, you know,
Yeah.
Augustine is really the one who inaugurates this, like what we associate with Descartes. this whole like I think therefore I am thing. Augustine doesn't say that exactly, but he recognizes that, if I'm capable of doubting, I must exist in order to doubt. And then Descartes, 1500 or, a long time later, says the same thing, really crystallizing that birth of an individual self in the modern sense. Um, and it took 2000 years for astrology to become like psychologized in a way, which is very different from this ancient practice, in the sense that now the locus of concern for the first time is really on the fate of each of us as an individual. And so, in some sense, that's putting a lot more pressure on the astrological meaning, um, to
Hmm.
to deliver to each of us in a unique way, right? Rather
Yeah.
than it being something we're held within collectively. Um, and that seems like a gain and a loss.
Yeah. Yeah. Because there's also certain presuppositions about what should unfold in a given life for it to be meaningful, but that maybe reflect a belief too much in the idea that this world is the only one and that
Mm,
health and prosperity, as we would define it, if this life is the only one, are the only things worth valuing. Whereas, like, the unpleasant aspects, the and malefic, circumstances, they might have a lot of significance from a more transcendent point of view. But when there's this, I guess part of the potential loss is that zeroing in on the individual in a way that overemphasizes the this worldly
mm,
meaning in connection with this worldly successes. And so that's one thing I've appreciated about what I've been learning from astrologers who have been practicing for a while, is that there's often this desire that people come with who are seeking an astrology reading to have that affirmed, or to have that given to them, when really maybe all the astrologer can do is to facilitate a kind of aesthetic appreciation for the cosmic ordering that the chart reflects, on the lifetime, or that the life, just the resonance between what the chart, the way the chart can speak, of the life. And so a kind of trust in surrendering to some kind of larger pattern, even if it doesn't always inflate the ego.
mm,
So I think that's part of what's been lost, is that more transpersonal and uh, transcendent dimension, to the extent that we're not just seeking out astrologers or readings that affirm that we're all going to have fame and fortune. And even though it's not a bad thing to want those things. That's one thing that this philosopher and astrologer Jeffrey Cornelius also touches on, is like, the astrologer should facilitate this aesthetic appreciation for the way the life is woven into the whole life of the cosmos, but also, you know, have a kind of warm sympathy for the client seeking warm-blooded fortune, as he puts it.
mm, mm,
But also, I just wanted to touch as well upon what this question you raised about the way that ancient people using astrology thought about freedom, or the lack thereof, or whether they embraced a kind of fatalism. This is actually a debated question, or claim. And you could say, and this is what some of historians and scholars of astrology and different divinatory systems say, is that the very existence of a divinatory system and any practices of magic and propitiation suggests that there's an awareness of some possibility for negotiating destiny or negotiating fate. So just the bare existence of something like that, where you can get a kind of like meta reflection on the cosmic circumstances suggests that it's not totally determined.
Mm, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Given how prevalent, you know, in the new age spiritualities that are on offer in the marketplace, that people tend to go towards things like The Secret, create your own reality. Like astrology actually kind of checks
Yeah.
that because you're subject to at least the seasons of,
Hmm.
planetary transits. You have to work with what's happening and not just think you can create everything from scratch yourself.
Yeah.
So I hadn't considered that that it actually might serve as a check to that more narcissistic tendency that you can sometimes find in New Age spiritualities. But I also love something Rudolf Steiner says. I think it's in interdisciplinary astronomy, though. I'm sure he says it elsewhere that he's worried about the way that natal charts, people relate to natal charts nowadays. So he says, if you really want to understand someone's karma in a given lifetime, you have to look at their death chart, not their birth chart. And that totally diffuses any risk of an individual becoming egotistically attached to, their natal chart or whatever, because it's not
Yeah.
for you anymore. At least not for your empirical self. It's for your transcendent I that, in the anthroposophical scheme of thought would reincarnate. So the death chart is significant for that maybe next reincarnation, that next incarnation, but um, it prevents you from getting too attached to who you think you are in this life, as if that is the be all and end all, like you were saying earlier. Um, so you mentioned Cornelius and divination, there are many astrologers who want to do some statistical analysis on different transits and, for example, how maybe Mars transits correlate with the start of wars or something. And um, just as one example, and or Saturn, Pluto, maybe, there are different ways you can look for what might be the trigger for a war to break out, um, archetypally speaking. And it seems like there's some evidence that maybe there is a statistically significant pattern, and other evidence that's like, no, probably not. How do you relate to that quest that some astrologers are on to, I guess, legitimize astrology by finding statistically significant patterns? Do you think that's a fool's errand, or it might be worthwhile, or do you not really care one way or the other?
Well, I think with larger historical patterns that are always non-identically repeating themselves, as exemplified by, Richard Tarnas's work, Cosmos and Psyche, which involves an interpreter,
Mm,
it's not just being produced by a machine, tabulating statistics,
yeah.
or through some kind of formula. I think there's definitely, and I've experienced, there's something to that. We're a part of the same community of philosophers and astrologers, and starting from when I arrived in 2017, there was this community anticipation of the Saturn Pluto conjunction coming in at the beginning of 2020, and we also knew that Jupiter and Saturn and Mars would all join them. Or sorry, Saturn, we already mentioned Saturn. And to witness that as a community and just see the pandemic unfolding right then. I mean, I get goosebumps now. Like I've been, and I've experienced a lot of moments of like testimony to the, what I refer to as like whatever reality aesthetic ordering of the cosmos. Astrology is a kind of distillate of that. That was a major moment. I've experienced other moments personally as well, but to share it and to have been anticipating it for years. I mean, so there's definitely something to that. But one of the things that Jeffrey well, Cornelius mentions in his book, or maybe it was in an interview, he is very critical of these statistical attempts to defend astrology based on statistics of, for instance, they did a study where they tried to find some kind of common aspect or placement in birth charts for people who commit suicide, and they had this whole like database of charts of people who had committed suicide, and they found absolutely no common denominator.
Mm,
And so I think that this is it sort of brings a epistemological or it's a metaphysical question, because is statistics operating more in accordance with um, um assumptions about the universe that reflect, well, materialism, like in that approach? And if we were to have a conception of the cosmos or of the real that included more layers, like, for instance, if we're just thinking with Steiner, like the etheric and the astral, might we then try to find other ways of, you know, evidence, arguing for evidence? But I think if one were to incorporate those other levels of reality, then what I emphasized about, if you are interested, have goodwill, openness to the possibility, then involving yourself in an inquiry of getting to know a little bit about your chart from someone who's skilled at interpreting charts, and then observing your own transits, I think is the the best way to
hmm.
to test its validity. It's not really one that can be just given to you. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question. What do you think about that question?
So just real quick, I want to show people uh this beautiful, wonderful website, Archetypal Explorer, that shows the wave patterns of how tight these aspects get. And this is back in 2020, so you can see the Saturn-Pluto
Hmm.
conjunction. And the worst of the pandemic is right over here when Jupiter was conjunct Pluto and getting into the action there. And yeah, like you couldn't ask for a more intense, obvious correlation there. But yeah, I think with statistics, I'm curious about it, but really
Yeah.
not at all interested in it as a way of proving astrology right or wrong. I feel like that's beside the point because I don't relate to astrology as a science. I think it has an empirical aspect to it, but it's a kind of archetypal empiricism. And what that means is that we're inevitably dealing with um, a semiotic, hermeneutical, interpretive
Yes.
art, right? And so it's more like divination, but it at least the difference between astrology and other divination methods, um,
Yes.
casting lots or the I Ching or tarot even, is that there is at least some
Hmm.
anchor in the real in nature in the sky. Um, and so that grounds it cosmologically in a way that other divination techniques are less so in a direct way, at least. But if we understand it as an interpretive art, let's say, then I think we can understand the evolution of consciousness and this participatory process where, now we're all literate, most of us, and we think that meaning is carried just in these like little alphabetic symbols that we're bombarded, that we live in an ocean of symbols nowadays. But for like primal people before they had writing and they were just beginning to work out even how to talk to each other, um, the sky and the constellations and the repetitive patterns of the wanderers through the fixed constellations would have been perceived. And you think in terms of like David Abram and like how he talks about the loss of animism as we de-animated nature and over-animated these little squiggles that we're obsessed with when we become literate. Like, I don't even think we can fully even appreciate how meaningful the patterns in the sky must have been to a pre-literate primal consciousness.
Hmm.
And, you know, Steiner makes these beautiful suggestions that actually the sky taught us the
Hmm.
alphabet. Like the constellations, the fixed constellations are the consonants, and the planets moving through the constellations are the vowels. And like that is actually the structure of what became written language that was taught to us by the sky. But once we learned it, we forgot we how to remain in communion with the sky as we became overly literate. And that's just a function of the evolution of consciousness. But if you remember and take seriously this process of evolution, I think it helps you make sense of how it could be that there is really that we're saturated in meaning, but it's not just mathematical
Yeah.
meaning, it's qualitative meaning. And so if it's a semiotic relationship that we have with the sky and not a merely mechanistic relationship, then we shouldn't expect there to be precise, like statistical correlations.
Mhm.
Um, and I'll just throw this into the mix because it might be interesting to some people who know about Charles Saunders Peirce and his triadic understanding of semiotics, which is different from a binary understanding of semiotics, where there's just the symbol and the thing it represents, a two-way relationship. In Peirce's understanding of it, there's always a third. There's the sign, the object it's supposed to represent, and then the interpretant, right? The
Hmm.
subject who is the one who is, in a sense, constellating the meaning between the sign and the thing it's supposed to represent. And I think when we lose the role of the interpretant and we collapse from a triadic understanding of semiosis and semiotics to a binary, which is typical of more representational accounts of cognition and everything, where it's just symbol and thing, and there's no room for a subjective interpretation, then we start to lose the ability to understand how astrological meaning is constellated, so to speak. Because the thing with these statistical tests is there's always going to be that element of interpretation required to say,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh, it's this aspect that's probably going to cause war, so let's look for correlations with that. Or, you know,
Yes.
when even do you decide when a war really begins and when it ends? And so there are all these interpretive aspects that you can't be strictly like mathematically precise about. And so I don't begrudge or even discourage anyone from seeking these statistical patterns, but it's less, uh, I'm less interested in it, you know?
Hmm. I think that's such an important, yeah, the way to frame it. And it brings me back to when you initially asked me about how I orient to skeptics and what I mentioned about wondering about their presuppositions, because I was thinking when you were saying that it's not just mathematical, there's something qualitative to it, and you got into semiotics, is that there's a presupposition in expectations for there to be a kind of straightforward, mathematical, repeatable outcome. I think that what is fundamental about the universe is the mechanism and the dead aspect of the world, but that we're always our inquiries are always starting from the experience of a living organism. And so the mechanical and purely mathematic is actually always abstracted from a, an, a living reality, that the mathematics is a kind of itself a frozen expression of something that is qualitative, that the mathematical is always a part of something that is also qualitative. And you could say that the mathematical is itself an aspect of the quality, depending on like, but when it's like set in motion, and that it reflects life. And so, one thing I've been pondering as I've been learning about Hellenistic astrology and just getting more into the weeds of the different systems, the different house systems, the different sign systems. So we have, the tropical zodiac, which people also refer to as the Western zodiac, which is based on uh, the light cycle in the northern hemisphere. And then there's the sidereal system, which, is based on the constellations. And these both have, histories to them. They didn't just come out of nowhere. And I've been wondering about, there's debates among astrologers about which one is the more correct one. There's people who take extreme positions claiming that one is the only right way to practice astrology, you know, because the stars are where they are now. If we are working with the tropical zodiac, then we're out of touch with the actual cosmos. So that invalidates it. That's sometimes something that skeptics who don't know anything about astrology will come with. And people like Adam Ellenboss and maybe Jeffrey Cornelius as well might make an argument like, well, these are self-contained oracular systems of symbolization. They don't need to be have any kind of empirical grounding in empirical reality to speak, to have this divinatory function. But as you said, what distinguishes astrology from other systems of divination is that it does have this external or objective reference of the actual moving planet. So there's somewhat of an inconsistency there. And so I've really been, and I personally don't feel satisfied with the argument that all systems of astrology are, and I don't think they're necessarily saying this, that all systems of astrology are the same. I think they would say that a good astrologer is really grounded in their tradition and that the tradition, ideally doesn't just come out of thin air, although maybe it does if there's some kind of, really genuine download or channeling happening, because there's some lore about the beginnings of Hellenistic astrology emerging out of some kind of download or initiatory gift from Hermes or something. But so I've been pondering all of this at the same time as I was finishing my dissertation, on the work of Owen Barfield, and Rudolf Steiner. And Rudolf Steiner in Leading Thoughts and elsewhere, he describes this, gradual evolution of consciousness, which could be described as the gradual internalization in humanity of the cosmic intelligence or the cosmic thinking. And there's this awakening of self-consciousness through this capacity through thinking to make the distinction between subject and object. And then science emerges out of this, this increased aspiration for precision when it comes to the conceptual relations that we're able to uh, unfold, or illuminate about the world. And in this narrative of the evolution of consciousness, Steiner says that in in correspondence with the internalization of the cosmic intelligence, which as it waxes, as it awakens in humanity, there's this increased freedom. There's also this gradual actual disanimation of the cosmos. So he says it went from an incalculable order that was bound up with the life of the gods to a completed work in our time. And so he says, I don't know if this is true, but it's just interesting to consider in connection with these different systems, because Hellenistic astrology would have emerged as a system at the time when he says there was still something of this living relationship of the
Wow.
cosmos with the gods. And so you could say it's a kind of, it wouldn't necessarily it be a contra or a you could think of Hellenistic astrology as, even though even and maybe because it emerged in a certain time and place that maybe had some kind of significance for the whole earth at a certain time, to be a kind of vestige of that time and something that we could touch into, to foster a newer relationship with the gods, even though they've seemed to, like as Schiller says, like fled from the cosmos, in what is his the twilight of the gods. So this is something I've thought about, like as one way of thinking through. But then, it would maybe perpetuate
Schiller, or did you mean Nietzsche? Twilight of the Idols, or are you talking about Schiller's
Schiller had that
epic
play,
letters?
right? Or the poem, The Twilight of the Gods, and I
Oh,
think
it's a poem
Nietzsche
by him.
was
Okay,
kind of riffing
I
on
see.
that. It was
Gotcha.
like one of the first places where there's this idea of disenchantment first
Mm,
gets,
right.
dramatically expressed, um but then, I mean, I don't want to perpetuate the tendency of being like, well, this is the only right way to interpret, or this is the only right system. But it's just an interesting thought, in connection with the evolution of consciousness and
Yeah. I mean, part of the background metaphysical, I don't know if it's an assumption, it's more just a recognition here is that cosmos and psyche, the universe and consciousness are, um, as you go back in time, less and less differentiated. And so rather than the modern scientific materialist orientation that would say, well, whatever the psyche is, whatever human consciousness is, it kind of grew out of a primarily material, mechanistic, physical process. So there was no mind in the universe for billions of years, and then it suddenly got excreted somehow by brains. Um, and in that sort of a cosmological picture, it's like, yeah, astrology is clearly just a bunch of projection by a monkey that got too full of itself. But if you take this more esoteric view of the history of the universe, I mean, the evolution of consciousness is the evolution of the universe. Um, but it's a process where, originally mind and matter were not two separate things. Subject and object hadn't differentiated. And what we nowadays call matter, right, in the age of the consciousness soul and the anthroposophical scheme, uh, is a result of how consciousness itself has developed. Matter is
yeah,
perfectly real, but also uh, a function of the evolution of consciousness, not a primary reality that we somehow have to explain how consciousness comes out of. Um, and so if you have that backdrop, astrology starts to make a lot more sense. But um, I don't know that many, I think there are many people like you when you were a teenager who get into astrology who don't initially have the cosmological
hmm
interpretive scheme to make sense of it.
yeah,
And many times the skeptics uh, are assuming the common sense metaphysics of our time, which is materialism. And in that context, astrology can seem pretty silly.
yeah. Well,
Uh,
this Rick always says the gold standard of superstition.
yeah. So, but you've also been emphasizing how important the practice dimension of this, like you're talking about how people practice astrology. This isn't just a theory. This isn't a belief system. It's
Yeah,
a practice. It's a ritual practice. Um, and there's a kind of cosmic reverence that I think spills out of that ritual participation, um, and allows us to maybe heal what has been severed. Um, and so it might actually serve not only a psychological role for us, but a collective social, cultural role for us
yeah,
to begin to feel more at home in the universe, um, and to relate to the Earth and the other planets, not just as rocks or balls of gas, but as, presences. And like they have an interiority. We see them and they see us. And I think that could be tremendously healing, um, culturally, right? And so it's both exciting to see how popular astrology is right now for that reason, because I see that potential, but also I worry because of how it gets interpreted in materialistic ways, because of that common sense being the dominant backdrop. Even for people who get into astrology, they might still think of it like, oh, there's something raining down from the planets that's
yeah,
making me this way, or thinking it in a causal mechanistic way. Um, and all of these nuances we're throwing in, like, oh, semiotics and hermeneutics, it's like a little too grad schooly, and um, and so like. there's still this gap between the new cosmological imaginary, wherein astrology takes on renewed meaning, and the dominant mechanistic picture of the universe, and trying to like graft astrology onto that somehow, that I feel like creates this struggle and the danger of a kind of narcissistic relationship to one's birth chart that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just want to emphasize this ritual dimension of it. It's a practice. It's not a belief system. And maybe this is a segue into the consultation practice that you're about to start. Do you want to share a little bit about that and what's motivating you to step into that practice, offering this to others at this time in your journey?
Yeah, well, I have considered doing it at different points in my life, especially when I first started the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program. But I had ambivalence because I felt like there were just certain things, especially if I was going to include the zodiac signs and the house systems, that I didn't quite understand the rationales of. And since I've been learning about the Hellenistic tradition, which is where many of these conventions come from, or were first established, so this is like like basically, and Plato's philosophy has a huge influence on it. Many of the astrologers that make up the corpus of the Hellenistic tradition are referring to Plato. They would consider themselves Platonists. And this system begins with the cosmogonic polarity and fans out from it, that with the sun and the moon and the planets up to Saturn forming polarities with each other, and just yeah, it's just this beautiful system. But there was this project in the 1990s called Project Hindsight, where astrologers were finally getting a hold of Hellenistic texts that they hadn't had access to in the, like, I guess the last 200 years, at least in the English speaking world. And a lot of these texts were first translated just in the last century. And so there's a kind of like rebirth of astrology happening since the 90s, with the recovery of these rationales, for instance, the house system being based actually not on the 12 zodiac signs in order, which is what many people learn when they're just sort of self-studying, learning astrology on their own, but actually the house system is based on this geocentric picture that the chart represents, and the primary motion of the earth revolving, on its axis, and just like the sort of significance attributed to different sections of the sky, and as well, uh the connection between the signs and the houses. And so yeah, I have decided to begin doing astrological consultation or counseling. And I'm just excited about that. And after, having been in grad school for so long, to have something, as you described, this ritual practice of being able, and this is something I've always kind of, uh, I don't know if envied is the right word, but among my friends who are practicing astrologers, wish I had, beyond just my own, consideration of my chart in connection with transits, what it's like when you have client after client after client, and there's like these themes that start emerging with the, similarities between the clients, and just the way in which to kind of open a portal, when you have a reading with intention and
You
can.
become like an archetypal thermometer as a an astrologer who gets to take the collective temperature in a sense when you see a bunch of clients, you know. You really
Yeah.
know how a certain transit might be coming through because you're seeing how it inflects different people's charts. That is a unique insight that you gain through doing consultations. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and she's no longer a practicing astrologer, but and she's an academic. She wrote this really interesting dissertation that she turned into a book on the role of the daimon in astrology. and Dorian Greenbaum. You
Hmm.
can find the book on the internet. So this is also a factor that involved, in astrology as like a kind of spiritual practice that you are, really channeling the daimon. Like you're kind of trying to get out of the way so that there's some kind of oracular event that transpires between you and the client, not that you are it's sort of like Steiner talks about each human being has their own guardian angel. It's the same idea, and that we can, when we meet, have this aspiration that our angels will be interacting with each other, so that we're sort of attuned to the highest good of that moment. But yes, so I'm going to start doing that. I'm excited.
Um, I'm glad you brought up Neoplatonism. Oh, and I'll link to your website for folks that are curious to learn more about your consultation practice. But yeah, you brought up Neoplatonism, and it reminds me of Plotinus, who already in the second century was criticizing this idea that uh, there's some deterministic influence from the planets on the human
Hmm.
soul. He's like,
Yeah.
no, you're free, but the planets, they're not causes, they're signs, right? And so
Yes.
he already had this semiotic understanding, which I think is carried through the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition and is still accessible to us and such a reasonable way of understanding um, the astrological impulse that doesn't require or risk becoming uh, just the puppet of astrological influences, right? So,
Yes, yes. I think that's why, Platonism, you could say, was like a source of freedom, and that astrology is like a technology of Neoplatonism. Because really, I think, there's different interpretations, but like you said, echoing Plotinus, I think the Hellenistic perspective, at least as it's generally represented, is that and it maybe next time we can talk about this how should I put it? It's like a symbol that astrologers used for teaching the system. It's called the Thema Mundi, or the birth chart of the world, and it really just shows the intricate patterning that the chart, or the picture is a kind of like mandala of the cosmos, and that the astrology can be a technique for attuning to the logos that transcends the particular symbols, because we're always being challenged to synthesize them somehow and not just read them as abstract, always meaning the same thing in every combination, but actually they could have very different meanings from the general meaning. For instance, like, Venus is associated with like love and beauty and harmony, but placed in a certain way might almost mean the opposite. So it's the
mhm.
fact that things can flip in that way, I think just gets at the fact that astrology really is this technology for stepping down from the overdetermined reality, the overdetermined meaning that is the reality of the cosmic process, into something that we can use to like focus on a particular question or concern
Mhm.
with these, yeah, so stepping it down into a diversity of symbols and getting specific, like almost like a magnifying glass.
Mm. Yeah. Um, just seeing if there's anything else I wanted to get into. I don't think so. Um, do you feel like there's anything important to tie up that we laid out without fully digesting or
Well, just, one thing that Jeffrey Cornelius points out, and Steiner also touches on this, is that there is an astrology of signs and an astrology of causes, and so that
Hmm.
there could potentially be a way in which astrology and a science that is reflects a fuller embrace of the layers of reality could come together. But Cornelius kind of leaves that, he doesn't know how to get there. I don't know how to get there, but Steiner does sometimes say things like, and we have to remember that for Steiner, the cosmos is this organic living reality, with not just these, empty space with these different objects acting on each other. Um,
Mm,
that there are somehow there's both, and I think actually Plotinus even makes some room for this, that there's the layer of like influence, from the cosmic bodies, and there's also this kind of like deeper layer of the semiotic of the whole, and like segments of the whole, and so it's there's a
yeah.
big mystery and we can eliminate some of it, but there's a lot of mystery.
Yes. So it's both a ritual practice and an opportunity for cosmological research, right? Um,
Yes.
hmm, amazing. Well, um, thanks for digging into some of the mystery with me. As Whitehead says,
Likewise.
the wonder remains. Um, and good luck with the inauguration of your consultation practice.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Um, talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.